welcome to our short introduction to the first readings at Weekday Mass for this 12th week in Ordinary Time. This week we continue with our reading of the second book of the Kings, and this week really marks in many ways a transition from the history of Israel and Judah into the books of the prophets, which we begin next week for the following few weeks. The first readings are interrupted quite a number of times this week because we have all these different feast days, but nonetheless it's worthwhile having a look at the broad sweep of history, even though we don't get it all, even in the continuous reading of the first readings. We begin in quite a sad place in many ways because we hear that the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed. Don't forget, after the reign of Solomon, at the beginning of the reign of his son Rehoboam, then the kingdom is split into two. So Israel is no longer a united kingdom of the 12 tribes, but 10 tribes form the northern kingdom of Israel, whilst the remaining 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, form the southern kingdom of Judah. Judah's monarchy always maintains that Davidic line. So even though the kingdom is snatched from Solomon's son Rehoboam, then Rehoboam remains the king in Judah, living in Jerusalem, where Solomon has built the temple. The northern kingdom goes off on its own course. So it's important to remember that Judah's kingdom maintained the monarchy in the line from David and Solomon. It's sad on Monday's reading because we hear in very brief description the disaster that befalls the northern kingdom of Israel. The northern kingdom has made various alliances with different regional powers at different times, but also at times has broken them as well. This results in the power of the Assyrian Empire coming and breaching the walls of the northern kingdom and completely destroying it. What they then do is they then plant other people from different countries into the land of Israel. However, they find that lions come and attack them and other various wild beasts, so they send for priests from amongst the Israelite population to pacify the local guard. They find that doing this works because the Lord relents and doesn't continue to constantly attack the new inhabitants of Samaria, as it is called. And that's where we get the origin of the Samaritans from, is the Jews regarded the Samaritans really as heathens or heretics because they were the descendants of those who had been planted into Israel after the destruction of the northern kingdom. They were seen as having a syncretistic type religion, which blended elements of other religions into the faith of the covenant that God had made with his people. This was not uncommon at the time, it has to be said, because we see that the editors or the writers of the book of the Kings have a very particular perspective, following in that of the prophet Elijah, that God is the only one who is to be worshipped, the Lord who is the God of heaven. No other gods are to be worshipped. And that eventually becomes what we call monotheism, that there is only one God, the Lord who created the heavens and the earth and all that is in them. Over the course of the rest of the week, we hear of the next 150 or so years of the kingdom of Judah, which has its high points and sadly also many low points, before coming to what can only be described as a sorry end. We hear in the readings as we go on only about Judah from now on. And firstly we hear about Hezekiah, who is one of the faithful kings of Judah in the line of David. We hear also how the Assyrians attack Jerusalem but do not conquer or defeat it. While taunting Hezekiah, Hezekiah goes to the house of the Lord, to the temple, to ask for the Lord's help. And so the Lord sends Isaiah to him, as he had done to his father Ahaz. Don't forget the Emmanuel prophecy in the book of the prophet Isaiah is during the reign of Hezekiah's father Ahaz. So Isaiah continues to prophesy, and here we get independent confirmation of Isaiah's presence in and around Jerusalem at that time in the books of the Kings. It's also important to remember that the books of the Kings, whilst they do present history, present it from a very particular point of view. The books of the Kings aren't interested in doing neutral history, rather. They do everything from a theological perspective. Neutral history is more of a modern conception than it would have been at the time, because they see everything through the lens of the covenant that God made with his people Israel. That is, that they are to worship the Lord, the God of heaven alone, and no others. And God in return will give them protection, give them his help, be their God. Any covenant, whether it's made between two powers on earth or between God and people, as we hear in the book of Deuteronomy, lays out the blessings attached to keeping it and to the consequences for not doing so. And this is what we see played out over these 150 or so years between the destruction of the northern kingdom and the eventual demise of the southern kingdom as well. Hezekiah's prayer, as I said, is answered by Isaiah on behalf of the Lord, who promises him that Sennacherib, who is the king of Assyria, will not triumph, will not be the one who prevails in the end. The Lord will fight on behalf of Israel, and so he does. The Lord goes out and strikes down a large portion of the Assyrian army in the night, and so therefore Sennacherib flees back to Assyria, and there is assassinated by his own people in a political plot. And really that marks the eventual decline of the Assyrian Empire. Over the next century or so, we see the increasing power of Babylon. And Babylon eventually will be the one who brings about the destruction of the southern kingdom. But as Hezekiah is portrayed as generally faithful, that he believes in the Lord, he promotes the worship of God, although it is tempered by the fact that he never tears down the high places associated with other gods. It is Hezekiah's grandson Josiah who will eventually do this, or rather his great-grandson, because Hezekiah's son Manasseh reigns for quite a long time, reigns for about 50 years in Jerusalem, although he is presented as being constantly unfaithful. Manasseh's son Ammon only reigns for about 2 years before coming to a sticky end by being assassinated by his own people, and then begins the reign of Josiah. And Josiah is portrayed as one of the great periods in Judah's history. Josiah finds in the clearing out of the temple that they find the book of the law, undoubtedly what we would now regard as the book of Deuteronomy. Having read it, or a priest having found it, gets a scribe to go and read it to the king, who is mortified at finding that there are all these laws that no one is keeping in the kingdom. So therefore the king sends the priest and the scribe and his secretary to go and find the prophet. And so they find in Jerusalem the prophetess Huldah, who says to them that all is not lost, that yes, the Lord has willed destruction as the consequences of breaking the covenant, but that yet the Lord may relent if they keep it. So the king has the book read to all the people, who agree to keep all that is within it. Josiah then sets about major religious reforms, centralizing worship on the temple in Jerusalem, tearing down the high places, and making the Passover pilgrimage feast. Sadly, Josiah meets an early and unfortunate end, because Assyria and Egypt come combine together to try to defeat the emerging power of Babylon. Josiah goes out to meet the Pharaoh as he's trying to pass through Judah, because the only way to get from Egypt further north is to pass through the territory of Judah. Josiah remembers all that happened in Egypt according to the books, and so therefore goes out to meet Pharaoh in battle. However, Josiah is defeated in battle by Pharaoh and killed. Josiah's son is put on the throne, but only lasts 3 months before Egypt deposed him and put his half-brother on instead. Jehoiakim is reigned for quite a long time, and we hear more about him in the prophet Jeremiah. Because although he was Josiah's son, he didn't follow in Josiah's ways. He is presented as being unfaithful and generally uninterested in anything other than his own reign. Therefore, when he eventually finds out he can get out of being a vassal to Egypt, subject to Egypt, he ends up being, for a while, vassal to Babylon, before then rebelling and trying to get out of it, whilst he feels Babylon is distracted. This does not go down well with Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who sets out to destroy Jerusalem. However, when he gets there, Jehoiakim has died, and his son Jehoiakim is now on the throne. Jehoiakim's reign is presented as short because Babylon attacks, defeats the Judean army, exiles the kings, the nobles, the military, and leaves only his uncle, who is the one of Josiah's sons, and again the half-brother of Jehoiakim as king. Zedekiah really is unfortunate, because as we hear frequently in Jeremiah, Zedekiah always wants to do the right thing. He always wants to be there as the good king, as the faithful one, to do what the Lord wants, which is why he does, in a limited way, protect Jeremiah from attacks of others, but ultimately never manages it. His own weakness, his own sense of insecurity ultimately overcome him. Having tried to get out of paying tribute to Babylon, then Nebuchadnezzar returns, this time determined to destroy Jerusalem, and on this occasion he succeeds. After a 3-year siege, then the city is pretty much starved, and they cut off the water supply as well. Jerusalem is a city on its knees when it is eventually captured. And so Zedekiah tries fleeing in night through the wall, but is, however, captured on his way. And his punishment is to see his sons executed in front of him before he has his eyes put out by the Babylonians, and then led off in chains, be a prisoner in Babylon. The editors or the writers of the books of the kings see this destruction of Jerusalem as the consequences of breaking the covenant. The people over generations, with some notable exceptions in the time of Hezekiah and Josiah, are presented as being unfaithful, and therefore they have to take the consequences of what happens. However, the books of the kings do not finish on an unhappy note, because it may look to all intents and purposes, with the temple gone, with the monarchy finished, that's all is lost for the kingdom. But we hear that after the final defeats of Jerusalem, Jeconiah is released from prison and is treated well by the king of Babylon as a foreign king, even though one who is entirely subject to Babylonian rule. It therefore holds out the possibility that, just as Jeremiah prophesied, that in 70 years the kingdom will be restored once more. The line of David is not finished, but may yet carry on. Breaking the covenant has its consequences, but ultimately the Lord who is faithful forgives and will restore Jerusalem once more. as we will hear in the prophet Jeremiah, when we can come to reading it, that sometimes it is through the destruction that hope emerges and something new can come out of it. So that's where we finish. That whilst it is quite hard and quite sad to read the stories of this week, it doesn't finish without hope. Hope that the Lord who is merciful forgives and restores.